Hi, it's Dennis Daly. For nearly 40 years, investigative reporter Jack Anderson was a major force in journalism in the nation's capital and the nation. I'm just grateful I knew him. And here's a long-form interview I did with him. You think of a muckraker, a crusading reporter, an investigative reporter par excellence. Jack Anderson has been in print and on the air for more than 4 decades, and he is my special guest. I first met Jack Anderson nearly 20 years ago when I was working for another network as a producer. I was helping him put together his daily radio show. We have become good friends, although haven't seen each other many times over the years. He has a wonderful book out in which he traces I'll let him tell you what it is. He traces the trail of money, if you will, in the federal government. Ironically, I had to go to Los Angeles to talk to Jack back in Washington. Jack joins us via satellite. Jack Anderson, welcome to this week's American Montage. Let's get to the heart of the matter. Washington, it is indeed money, is it not, that you think is the root of all evil?
We're spending our children's money. That's taxation without representation. That is immoral. They're going to hate us for it. We're charging our government services and our standard of living to our kids by spending their money and expecting them to pay for it when they start paying taxes. They're going to hate us for it. They're going to come to Washington in droves saying, hey, we won't pay.
One of the things that worries me is I'm going to be 50 in a couple of weeks, is all of this talk about what's going to happen to Social Security. I mean, when I was in my 20s, 30s, and somewhat into my 40s, that never bothered me before. It seems that there are so many things in our society, whether it's what you're talking about or bridges that are going to fall apart, that we did not look very far over the horizon.
You're right. The Social Security is the pot of gold at the end of your rainbow. When you arrive there, you're going to find the pot of gold is really filled with IOUs.
Jack, what does it feel like to have been in on a lot of this? I don't mean in a culprit fashion, but privy to a lot of what was going on and see this happen and yet can't seem to wake anybody up. You must have had some pretty sleepless nights.
Well, it's because politicians by their nature like to spend money and don't like to cut the spending, because they get votes by spending money. When they're forced to cut, when there is so much pressure upon them that they must cut, then they operate on the federal budget with a meat axe instead of a scalpel. They cut across the board. They cut across the board because they don't want to cut specifics. When they cut specifics, they get specific voters angry at them, so they just cut numbers, and they cut across the board. When they cut across the board with a meat axe, that leaves it up to the people who are being cut to decide what to cut. And these bureaucrats, they get a little unruly. They get a little angry at having their budgets cut and their pay and promotions reduced. And so they cut they cut our needs and keep their wants.
Jack, that's one of the strong points you make in the book, and I hate to dump on just one legislator here, but Robert Byrd's name seems to come up. Here's a fellow who has done well for many of the people in the state of West Virginia. Can you explain for us how what are affectionately called pork barrel projects seem to somehow show up in other legislation, and as you say, you need to get in and look for those instead of taking the easy way out when it comes time to cut?
Well, you're right about Senator Robert Byrd. He gave up the Senate leadership in order to head the Appropriations Committee. He's a Democrat, so now he's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Appropriations Committee. He understands the rules and regulations of the Senate better than any other individual. He uses his power, his seniority, his former chairmanship, and his understanding of the rules to route projects to West Virginia. If you visit West Virginia, you'll drive down Robert C. Byrd Highway. You'll stop at Robert C. Byrd Park. You'll find Robert C. Byrd's statue. Incidentally, I've seen that statue. It has its palm outstretched, obviously, waiting to get more money.
Jack, in your book, Washington Money Go Round, you trace a lot of money trails, power, and influence. Before the break, we were talking about Senator Byrd and all the things he's done for his home state of West Virginia. I guess it all boils down to oratory, to rhetoric, to buzzwords, to slogans.
Rob, let me tell you, you've heard President Clinton talk about the bridge to the 21st century. Robert Byrd will make sure that it's built in West Virginia.
Jack, let's look at the other side of that. One of the last medical appointments I had in Washington before moving here to Los Angeles was with my dentist. And he told me that he regularly goes with a group of dentists down into Appalachia to treat the poor down there. And the most common request they get from these people is, will you pull the rest of my teeth? Because they're in agony.
Well, we have a program to help the poor down there, but the program has been botched. And so the rich are getting most of the money. The money was supposed to go to Appalachia to help the people whose teeth are rotting. Instead of that, most of the money is going to, as pork, to affluent states surrounding Appalachia. It's one of the great money scandals of our time.
Do I sound naive asking the simple question, how can that happen in America?
Well, it happens in America because members of Congress are looking for ways to get reelected, and the best way to get reelected is to pour benefits into their home districts. Everybody in America is against government waste unless it's being wasted upon them. They're against government entitlements unless they feel they're entitled to it. It's a moral question. Some historians who've chronicled the rise and fall of nations believe that the chief cause of their downfall has been moral decay. You know, the real test of national character is not adversity, it's affluence. Nations that have summoned the strength to overcome adversity have lacked the strength to endure affluence. So the great agonizing question mark that hangs over America is, can the most prosperous nation in history survive its affluence? We just keep spending.
What are your feelings about term limits?
Term limits, I knew in advance that it would not pass the House. It did not pass the House. It doesn't pass the House because the people in Congress don't want term limits. The people outside of Congress do. They're not going to get term limits because it'll get rid of the majority of the people who really hold the power in Congress.
But your own personal feelings about it?
If you have term limits, you're going to throw the baby out with the bathwash, and I'm kind of reluctant to do that. But I've come around to the view that term limits are necessary to get rid of the present system, the present kind of Congress we have. They've become professional legislators. This was never the intention of our founding fathers.
Jack, recently you went to Capitol Hill with this book. I know there's that great story about when Frank Capra showed Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. In Washington, it was only politely received because of, sticking it to Congress. What kind of reaction have you gotten on the Hill?
I get the reaction I always get. They're all, to my face, they're all for it. They're all against waste. They're all for saving money. They're all for economy. Until you get talking about their pet projects, until you get talking about their particular pork, until you get talking about the benefits to their particular constituents.
So nothing changes?
Nothing changes. I run the old Grace Commission. The late Peter Grace found massive waste in government. They called it the Grace Commission. People didn't realize that I was the co-chair, and Peter died on me, so I wound up as the only chairman left. And we're trying to get rid of waste in government. We've gotten rid of about $450 billion, so it's not a bad record so far. But it's a matter of integrity.
You have a wonderful new book out there called The Washington Money Go-Round, and we were talking about integrity before the break. I understand you have a pledge that you would like legislators, lawmakers to take.
Well, I'm asking members of Congress and voters alike to sign this pledge. For my country's sake, as well as for my own sake, I make this public pledge. For the character of each citizen will determine the character of America. I will treat as a sacred trust any public funds that pass through my hands. Tax revenue does not belong to the officials who spend it, but to the American people who produce it. I will not demand entitlements that I'm not entitled to. Government benefits are showered upon Americans not as manna from heaven, but as charity from the taxpayers. I will support a national effort to stop running up the national debt. It is immoral to charge our living standards and government services to our children. I will live on what I have, not on what I want. Squandering money today at the expense of tomorrow will increase the cost and multiply the misery. To reverse the American decline, I will consume less, work harder, and produce more. I will perform honest work for my wages and pay honest wages for another's work. If it isn't right, I won't do it. If it isn't true, I won't say it. If it isn't mine, I won't take it.
Jack, that's a lovely piece of work.
And by making it a public pledge, I think maybe they're going to be embarrassed enough to vote right on a lot of issues.
Jack, you use the word discipline there. You are well known as a family man, raised and a practicing Mormon, a lot more strict ethics, I think, in carrying out your life than maybe some of us in other sects. That whole issue of discipline, where did that go? I mean, maybe I'm naive in saying this, and I've used the word naive about myself twice, but is there something that happens to someone when they come to Washington and sit in that seat?
Well, actually, I would say, Dennis, that Washington is just a reflection of the people. It's just a mirror that reflects the people at large. The mirror reflects what it sees, and the members of Congress are a reflection in the glass. The good people in Washington can rise and soar to greater heights. The bad people in Washington sink to lower depths. But I think essentially they're a reflection of the people at large. The percentages are about the same that you find out there on the West Coast where you are.
Jack, I know you've heard a million stories about waste, but I want to relate something from my own experience and have you comment on this.
Sure.
For the better part of a year, early in my career, I was a congressional press secretary, one-term Indiana Democrat David Cornwell. I started nosing around the Longworth office building, and in one cavernous closet, I found thousands of publications, some of them beautiful coffee table books on the history of the Capitol building, that were sitting there collecting dust because in the fly it had said a gift of the 96th Congress or the 98th Congress or Congressman Frelinghuysen, so that they could not be given away after that Congress was over or the congressman was out of office. So I'm looking at these things and saying, well, my goodness, there's thousands of dollars worth of civic textbooks here, but they're sitting there because they just don't have the right number in the front. So I use my congressman's franking privilege, the right to put his name in lieu of a postage stamp, and shipped all of that back to the Catholic schools in southern Indiana.
That was a great idea.
But what I'm suggesting is, instead of having everybody have, like I was at the ag department, whenever my boss got a promotion, he had to throw out his letterhead. Why can't we print books that simply have a slip put in the front that says gift of the 101st Congress, rather than embossing them? Because there must be $1 million worth of beautiful books in the House and Senate office buildings that are going to be recycled that could be given to the schools.
You're absolutely right, and your experience is multiplied by the millions. I mean, Washington is full of equipment that doesn't work or that has become obsolete, spare parts that aren't needed and can't be used. We've built bridges that go to nowhere, dams that leak. I mean, we just squandered the taxpayers' money as if there'll be no tomorrow. But tomorrow is coming, and we're not going to be able, or our children at least, and grandchildren are not going to be able to afford it.
Jack, on the downside, if something isn't done, what is this country going to be like in 20 years, 25, 50?
Well, the most likely, I hate to say this, actually I believe the bridge to the 21st century that the president is trying to build has two branches. One leads uphill. It's steep and rocky, but it's sunlit. It's illuminated by the sun. The other is smooth and easy going downhill, but it's got the storm clouds. If you take the smooth and easy way, we're heading for disaster. If we keep spending and spending without paying for our living standards and our government services, we're going to go broke. Just like your family would go broke if it spent more than it took in. Just like your business would go bankrupt if it spent more than it earned.
You were saying that we're taxing not only ourselves to death, but the next generation.
Do you know how much taxes you're paying? Do you have any idea? Make a guess, Dennis.
I personally?
What percentage?
Well, I was having my taxes figured last night. It scared me to death. It's a bunch, 20, 30?
20 or 30, you're just talking about income taxes. Total taxes, guess what it is? If you're a typical average American, you are contributing about 45% of your earnings to the government in some form or other.
So you're figuring sales tax, property, everything.
Those are taxes.
Yeah,
I'm
they
figuring
sure are.
state tax, local tax, county tax,
user
sales
fees
tax,
now,
and a lot of hidden taxes.
Yeah.
But
So almost half of what I earn goes back to the
almost half of what you earn goes to the government. Do you know that we fought the Revolutionary War over a 1% tax?
Seems ridiculous now.
Yeah.
You know,
we fought the Revolutionary War because the British raised taxes on the colonialists.
Isn't there a temptation in this wonderful country where we have seen westward expansion, we've been taught all the traditions, we are in some ways the chosen people here, to even conceive of this country coming apart? I mean, don't we have an inertia psychologically to think that this wonderful golden land is going to go on forever?
Yes, and I've fallen prey to that myself. I've thought my children and grandchildren would automatically inherit the American dream, but let me tell you, that dream is not assured. That dream is not guaranteed, and they're much more likely to inherit a bankrupt nation, bankrupt financially, and bankrupt morally.
So what does that mean then? Obviously more crime. We're seeing that now. I guess maybe every generation, when it gets older, thinks that the young kids are going to heck in a handbasket. But things such as the deterioration of grammar. I had a discussion the other night with someone. I said grammar is important because it teaches children that there are rules concerning things. I mean, it's more than just conjugating a verb. A young kid knocked me over in a shopping mall a couple of years ago, right after I'd broken my leg and it healed. And I turned to the child and I said, "You're excused." And his mother says, "Don't talk to my child." And I'm thinking, where is society going? I mean, I went through 12 years of Catholic schools with nuns. I still open doors for women. I can't stand to see women smoke. And it's easy to say to yourself, where is society going? Is that the first visible sign a lot of us are seeing, the breakdown in rules and the increase in violence?
I worry about it. I'm concerned about it. And as I said, I quoted the historians who believe that the rise and fall of nations is caused by moral decay. And we've just had too much prosperity for too long, and prosperity breeds greed and envy. You talk about your experience. I came to Washington right after World War II, and I had lived in the shelter of the Rocky Mountains and brought up in an Orthodox Mormon home. And there were no murders out there in the Salt Lake Valley where I was brought up. I came to Washington, and I distinctly remember reading at the end of the year the murder total in Washington, D.C. And I was shocked to read that 9 people had been murdered that year in Washington, D.C.
Couple of years ago,
we get that many
Jack,
every day now.
Couple of years ago, Jack, wasn't it? 9 people. And you're there still in a city where, only 10% of the live births, they know who the father is? I mean, the statistics, you couldn't write them that badly.
Well, Washington is a microcosm of all that's gone wrong. You look at you take this 10 square mile and you get a picture of the future if we continue to rely upon government solutions. Because we have spent in Washington, and I've checked this out, I'm a reporter, and I checked it out very carefully, we spend more public money in Washington on education, more than we spend on any state or comparable city. More on education, more on housing, more on welfare, more on law enforcement than any other place in the United States. And what are the results? We have the worst, the most murders, we have the most robberies, we have the highest level of prostitution, arrests, we have the most crime, we have the worst schools. I mean, these government solutions simply don't work. We've got to get the people involved.
Jack, maybe you can answer something for me that I couldn't get a straight answer in 20 years in Washington. How did the District of Columbia, I'll say it, go to hell as it did Was it because of absentee landlords by the Congress? Did the heads of the committee, were they largely from southern areas and white and didn't like a northern non-white city? I mean, how did all of these things be allowed to fall apart in the backyard of the Capitol building?
Well,
I can remember.
I don't think it's racial. I think when I say that, I think that there are some racial causes for Washington's problems. I think it's a question of poverty and the solutions to poverty. As I said, the solutions that the leaders here have chosen have been government solutions. And I started out 50 years ago when I came to Washington believing in government solutions, believing that only the government had the resources to solve our problems. But the more I see of our problems and the government solutions and what happens when the government spends its money, the more opposed I am to government solutions. I have come to the conclusion that the most inefficient way to accomplish anything is to let the federal government do it. Now, there's some things the federal government has to do. It's got to wage war if we have to fight wars. But there are a lot of things the federal government doesn't have to do, and anything that the federal government doesn't have to do, we shouldn't permit it to do, because it will find the most inefficient way to do it. You told me of your experience on Capitol Hill. I just got back. I got Parkinson's, and if you hear a little tremor, that's me shaking like a one-man earthquake here in Washington. I got Parkinson's, and I went to see the head of Parkinson's research at the National Institutes of Health, and he was furious. He picked up a pencil and said, "Look at this pencil. Do you have any idea how much this pencil costs?" And I said, $1? Nope. He says it costs $14. Because we had to go through government procurement to purchase it. He says you can buy the same pencil for 75 cents at any store, and the government pays $14 for it. And then he complained about some other specific items, and he says they're robbing us of our research money. Our research money is not going for research. It's going for procurement and personnel.
I guess you've heard variations on the wonderful joke about the fellow who owed the IRS $450. So he sent them a box with 2 toilet seats and a pipe wrench.
The $436.
Yes.
Yeah, we found that, the $436 toilet seat. That was over at the Pentagon, and we suggested that the Secretary of Defense take a position on that.
Let me get into one area here. You say the government in many areas is the last unit to call on to fix things. What are your feelings about the role of religion, not just in ethics, but the churches in helping a lot of social problems?
Well, interestingly enough, I've seen the confidential polls. I follow them. I have sources on both the Republican and Democratic sides who show me the polls, the surveys that they take. It's important to understand these surveys because policy is based upon them. And President Clinton, above all the presidents I've known, reads the polls before he has breakfast in the morning. So it's important for us to follow the polls. The interesting thing is that politicians are almost at the bottom of the list of the people America trusts. But coming up, and almost to the top of the list, are religious leaders. So people are turning more and more to religion, less and less to government and politics. And so you've got a point. If we allow religions to distribute the charity, at least the people will have faith in it.
I have a good friend who is in Utica, New York, Ed Slusarzik, who heads a rural radio network there, Farm Broadcasters, raised in the Catholic tradition. Before Poland opened up, he was regularly having a drive where he would announce where they were going to park an empty semi in New England, and people could put supplies and non-perishables in there. It was then shipped to Poland and distributed, and he said that the head of the Polish government over there didn't even look at the contents. They were so welcomed in having the supplies, but that this effort by organized religion was the only arm that could have accomplished that. And I just wonder here, I guess there's a lot of work going on. We hear about the Salvation Army and other relief services, and the Mormon Church canning food, Amish doing the same thing, Catholic Relief, the Baptists, all the denominations. Maybe we need to congratulate those people more. Or maybe they just want to work behind the scenes.
Most of it, Dennis, is volunteer work. Most of the contributions come directly out of people's pockets, and there's very little overhead. Now, you contrast that to the federal government. We, at the Grace Commission, investigated 20 federal welfare programs, 20. We didn't finish one, so we only finished 19. But we found the same pattern. Do you want to make a guess about how much money the poor got per dollar out of every dollar?
Well, from your tone of voice, it's probably a nickel.
Well, it was a little more than that, 30 cents.
Well, that's still not much.
70 cents went to the bureaucrats. So when you have a federal welfare program, you've got a program for the care and feeding of bureaucrats, not for the care and feeding of poor people.
But yet, if you were going to donate money to a charity and saw the ratio as 70-30, you wouldn't give them a dime.
Absolutely not. And then we're just going over a pile of government grants. At the end of a fiscal year, the government, because it may have a little surplus money, scrounges around for ways to spend it. And it's just amazing. It's unbelievable. And yet I've seen the paperwork myself, the kind of things they spend money on, research grants. For example, I think my favorite was a study, $10,000. It doesn't seem like a lot of money, but $10,000 for the study of the south ends of northbound Alaskan sled dogs. Now, if somebody came to your door, knocked on your door, and asked you for a contribution for that, you'd laugh him off the door. You'd throw him out.
I'd think it was a joke.
You'd think it was a joke.
Yeah.
Well, it was the joke was on you, Dennis, and on me, and on the rest of the taxpayers. We actually paid for that. We paid for that study using thermometers.
I don't want to talk about it. Let's use the few minutes remaining here to point out kind of a personal thing. You and I first met, I guess, 15, I don't know how many years ago. You were doing a daily report for Mutual Broadcasting. I was a lowly producer over there. Have the issues that you've talked about in those ensuing 15 or so years changed very much? Is there a new issue that you wouldn't have even thought about that wasn't on the horizon back then? Or is it pretty much
the
same
issues
old,
are
same
somewhat
old?
the same, but I've detected, as I've suggested here, and as you seem to agree, that there's been a decline. There's been a decline in civility. There's been a decline in quality. When I came to Washington 50 years ago, America was number one in everything. Now we seem to be slipping, and slipping in the most dangerous way.
Jack, the clock is not our friend. We have to take a final break here. My special guest this week on American Montage is Jack Anderson. And this is American Montage on the United Broadcasting Network. This week on American Montage, we're talking via satellite to America's premier investigative reporter, Jack Anderson. For those who may not be old enough to know why Washington Money Go Round is a great title and kind of brings you full circle, can you remind us about that?
Oh, the column, which I inherited, and may I say that's the best way to get a column is to inherit 600 papers. That's how I got the column from the late Drew Pearson. He called it the Washington Merry-Go-Round. So the column I do is called the Washington Merry-Go-Round, but an even bigger story today is the Washington Money Go-Round.
Jack, one final thing, and not to put words in your mouth, I have to constantly explain to friends of mine about these darn tabloid shows on TV that I resent, and I'm not a good journalist. I mean, I'm a former disc jockey. I'm a talk show host. I really do not have the journalistic skills of a lot of people. I'm just kind of a performer, if you will. As they say on the Canadian Broadcasting Company, the news was read by Fraser Thomas. But I have to explain that there are different degrees of journalism. I mean, we at UPI and over at AP and Reuters, we're not driven really by ratings, but yet the news departments of most of the networks are now run by the entertainment divisions, and God knows what the driving force behind the tabloids is.
Well, I can tell you that it's not journalism. I tell my reporters that I don't know what the story is until I got the facts. Bring me the facts, and then let us decide what the story is. The tabloids decide what the story is and then go out to prove it. They're not journalists. They act as lawyers do. A lawyer can take a case and prove that O.J.'s innocent or prove that O.J. is guilty, depending on which side of the case they're arguing on. Well, that's what the tabloids do. They pick a story, say, wouldn't this make a great headline? Wouldn't this make a great story? Then they go out to prove it. And you can always find some nut who'll give you the kind of quotes that you want to get.
Jack, what does that do then to the young student? The kid who's really gung-ho about getting into broadcasting, is serious about journalism. They see all of this tabloid stuff. Should they give up on their dreams?
Oh, you can't give up on it because our profession is the only one mentioned in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers gave us freedom of the press because they understood that government by its nature oppresses those it has power over. They were determined that the government had to have a watchdog. And so they assigned in the Constitution itself that job to the press. As you say, sometimes we've been heroic, most of the time probably not. But what we're supposed to do in this country is absolutely essential, and it's absolutely essential that we do the job well. As I tell my reporters, bring me the facts as they are. Not as you think they are, not as you wish they were, not even as someone tells you they are. Double-check the facts and bring me the facts as they are. That's the story that we need to tell, and what we need are more reporters telling it.
I had a professor at Indiana University 30 years ago who said, news is not gossip with a dateline. I love that phrase.
That's a great quote.
Jack Anderson, your voice remains strong not only in print but on mic. I wish you good health, and thank you for a friendship of a lot of years. And I'm sorry the first time we get to talk face-to-face is 3,000 miles away.
Well, Dennis, it's good to hear your voice again.
Jack, thank you.
Bye-bye.
I must say that knowing Jack Anderson was one of the biggest thrills of my life. Long after his death, he still looms large as one of America's premier journalists. I'm Dennis Staley.